talngim oh you narawra wadal balula lembalti kare
Adalo siya malul total mera regulado plus iltunin oras setial el radio serial total tiawa gel baldusal ang diakal sel yoter tial radio show dingora ngari bibira information el mesomam el sel yogor ma adra blue lo bangel kal gestri del doctor STACI ngara ma Miguel May mela total mo gora mudo duri etia gora gatengel du el gemot mokri ngal toktang aja kalau bangke delokrasa studio el time ngara Miguel May latia gora wal da setong virtual virtual radio show mangara Miguel yang ngakatiang kadang dul masada gelurol ligil mokl raigal bisel lo mai silmerbela raigal margol rak malawai se insabira adlo bodong mala information al su diwaigal margol radio show al su ngari adal sal gora ngari akril se gol lo gel malawai se angel okyaga to gubet okyaga gidal tutau a doctor STACI Luis nga agar sel dai nga Stanford lorol girel sel tara trinting lorol longot mo kaya Stanford kasi ocean solution sel ocean solution ang wal gora ablo lo siga igel gora nger malubeng ngral sa ideologi ngir da sob clear tel tora avabe engam la urur belaw betorak meng elal time bai soal mo ora mo dongi meng mo ora o ai sa tigibel gora rek singi ra gaji del tora urul longot mokrbela ma dire el agel gora rek singi ra waskule mangara mangara madala say at this time I would like to ask STACI to give us a brief introduction a brief introduction of herself and who she is, and then the kind of work she's been coming back back to Palau over and over again to do in Palau, the work that she's doing in Palau. So STACI, it's all yours.
O'Neill Tutao, Ali, Mesulang, for the opportunity to talk to you all and share what I've been doing more recently in Palau. It's always been an honor to spend time with all of you. The work that I do is all because you all share such wonderful information with me. My name is STACI Lewis. I've been working in Palau for over 10 years now, and what I'm going to share with you today is the work that I've been doing since 2016 on Palau's fisheries value chains. And a lot has happened since 2016, and so the work that I'm doing is hopefully going to be providing the community with some information about how things have changed and what you all can do in the future to take those lessons learned, harness them, and move forward so that fishers and retailers and traders can improve their livelihoods. Thank you.
STACI mo ko lasig mlamo melas ngulumu lorora blur bela sera 2016 mal beto ka ora mlat change at gira la tora ba ora wala ma adireg bebi la 30 laurol dimla sel time bladu meng tialurere la mal agal lo mai sel memrul amal di mo ora malas mo mes selo así ay gayi del ora changes malu bay gayi del tol du ngarang gut makli ya o sisil time ngara umakara po dokor o mes ay gayi del na mo mere glurior dokor o mes así ngaray gel mlo ngil men sedel malmol malu bay ngaray gel ora amlo wal telmelel men sedel improve el gira seguir del tokor así value chain tial tokora fisheries seldu value chain et morol gire la sei ngal ngigil ngal wara value ring seldu value ring ngal gor o mesra sei nga seldu ngul mei seldu bora adro o medro ngul mei el otrur ngara sel el gora agel gagro sel tingila sel value ngal ngigil sel value tutlen ngal ngigil sei aloruria STACI. By the way, ngal STACI toktang raat tirgel kora walo suba walo suba blagrado la sei ay gal blagrado dong mokl ngara selwa bol kangesteringi malubeng klungelel malubeng telmelel guk merak langara sei ya Okay, that's very nice, Stacy. So you wanna start by sharing your slide and talk about the things you did while you're coming back over and over to Palau.
Yes, I would love to. So let me share my screen here. And I will take it your cue and when you would like me to pause and provide any clarifications.
Okay.
So the title of my slide is Simultaneous Interventions Impacting Palau's Fisheries Value Chains, and I'm going to break down each one of those words here in a second. But why it's important to observe these changes, because we're living in a changing world, and it's imperative to build value chains that can bear shocks. And observing how fishers and buyers are adapting to change as we see it will help us understand what attributes, what characteristics are important for these important actors to be able to bear shocks in the future. So what do we mean by fisheries value chains? I'm going to show you a graphic here. And what it means is the flow of fish from being caught, either wild or aquaculture, to being collected at a port or a market, being prepared, either processed, smoked, or any other value added, to being distributed, to then sales and consumers. And value chains are the dollars being attached to the fish along the way, so that we can see how much money is being made by the individual actors along the supply chain. Okay, so the interventions we're talking about in this presentation are three that happened around the same time. The first one is the Palau National Marine Sanctuary. The second is COVID-19 pandemic, and the third is the reef fish export ban. I'm going to walk you through how the PNMS catalyzed a supply disruption, COVID-19 catalyzed a demand disruption, and the export ban had an export disruption. The two main research questions that were underpinning our research were: what are the impacts to fish supply, price, and sales from these interventions? And what were the compounding effects? They're happening at the same time. And what did that mean for the three value chain nodes, the fishers, the traders, and the retailers in Palau? Okay, so we're going to jump into intervention one, which is the Palau National Marine Sanctuary. And as we all know, it changed the fishing activities in Palau's offshore area from establishing a 20% domestic fishing zone. We knew this was coming, and so in advance of that 2020 implementation of the PNMS, we did an assessment of Palau's fisheries value chains in partnership with PICRIC, University of Hawaii in Manoa, and National Geographic Pristine Seas. It had three components: a value chain analysis, a tourist survey, and a resident survey. I'm going to first focus on the value chain analysis. This provided us a baseline by which we've now been able to compare what's happened since 2020. Okay? So, pre-2020, we were able to see where the fish was going from Palau's offshore and nearshore area to the end consumers. And I'm going to show you a graphic that's going to show producers all the way to consumers, and lines going from those producers to the consumers, and the width the width of those lines indicate how much fish is being moved. Okay, so you can see here we have producers in the green boxes all the way to the end consumers going left to right, nearshore fishers, offshore fishers, and then the foreign-owned, both locally operated and foreign-operated vessels. You can see reef fishers have a lot of fish being moved into sales. And what's important to note here in this graphic is the foreign-owned, locally operated fleet was providing 90% of the offshore fish being sold in Palau before the Palau National Marine Sanctuary entered into full force in 2020. So we had an idea of what the fishery value chains looked like before PNMS, and we made some predictions based on that, what was going to happen after the PNMS. We knew that the economic model for offshore fishers were going to change. Those foreign fleets were going to be restricted to a certain area. They were going to be have to pay more export tax, and it's likely that they were going to exit the system. And if they left, so was that 90% of the offshore supply. And so what we then started to ask ourselves is, what happens when 90% of the offshore fish supply is no longer being provided in Palau? If the supply of offshore fish goes down, what's going to happen? Offshore fish price is going to go up. And that leads us to ask questions about what are tourists going to do if prices change. And that led us to our tourist survey. And we asked ourselves, what are tourists willing to pay for fish? And we answered these questions through surveying tourists in 2017, over 300 tourists. We gave them 12 different menus to choose from, and they got to choose reef fish, offshore fish, and both local sustainable fish and non-local sustainable fish. And what we found is that while tourists don't have a strong preference over reef fish versus offshore fish, they do have a preference when it comes to price. The more an offshore fish meal price costs, the fewer meals they're going to eat, and they will choose reef fish. So with a 5% increase in offshore fish meal, we would see a 10% increase in tourists' demand of reef fish. And that's equivalent to over 33,000 more reef fish base meals per year. And so our predictions were, if there isn't a ability to meet offshore fish demand, tourists are going to eat more reef fish. And possible outcomes include increased reef fishing, a decline in reef fish populations, and a decline in degraded coral reef systems. But we also found that there's hope. Tourists were willing to pay for a local sustainable brand of offshore fish. In fact, tourists were willing to move away from eating reef fish and willing to pay up to $10 more per meal. So capturing this willingness to pay could help fund investments in certification. We also found that 94% of tourists were willing to come to Palau even if they couldn't eat reef fish. So that's what we found before 2020. And as we leaped into 2020, what happened? A lot happened. So we were able to continue our work. And I just want to show here the data, the results I'm going to share now are based on 3 periods of surveying, 2020 through 2023. And we talked to small scale and industrial fishers, traders, and retailers. So to our first question, what were the impacts to supply, price, and sales from these interventions? And we're going to start with the PNMS. Okay? So what we saw, this is a graphic showing you supply, prices, and sales. We did see a decline in the tuna supply, much less when the longliners left. And that led to a huge increase in the price of tuna, jumping from $2.75 to $8.50. These are some quotes from our interviews here on the right. And what that meant is that sales from traders, and then because of COVID, sales from traders and retailers declined. But continuously, retailers continue to say they would still buy more offshore fish. It was available. Okay, so this prediction that we thought was going to happen before 2020, did it happen? It didn't, and it's because COVID stopped that increase in tourists moving over to reef fish. Okay, another thing that happened as a result of the PNMS is local Palauan companies like BOFI were able to start having a share of the market. And so they were able to start providing the offshore fish supply that wouldn't have been able to be provided while these foreign industrial fleets were dumping 90% of the offshore fish at very low prices. So what I'd like to talk about for a few seconds are really how BOFI kind of adapted over the first 3 years of their operations. This chart here shows just 2022 landings and how much of BOFI's business model, they're using both longline vessels and local fishers. You can see that local fishers provide a lot of the barracuda and Spanish mackerel and wahoo that BOFI sells, whereas the longliner vessel that they operate provides the tuna and the swordfish. They also started in year 1 mostly as traders, where they were purchasing catch and selling it. Year 2, they evolved into producers, where they were renting the longliner and selling their catch. And then by year 3, they were not only doing the producing, but they were processing fish and they were buying from local fishermen. And the interesting fact here at the bottom is that small-scale fishers represent over a quarter of all the catch BOFI sold in 2022. So BOFI is using both long-line vessels and local fishers as a way to provide offshore fish supply in Palau's value chains. So some key takeaways from that first intervention is that, yes, the PNMS did catalyze a decline in offshore fish supply, followed by a price hike. But the offshore fish supply resumed because of the establishment of BOFI, and it continues to evolve so that it can provide offshore fish in the value chain. And we did not see that increase in tourist reef fish demand because COVID shut down the tourist sector. So while there were a lot of impacts throughout Palau because tourists weren't here, some of the big concerns we had about an inconsistent offshore fish supply was actually did not come to fruition because tourists were no longer part of driving the food system. Okay. One more note about the Palau National Marine Sanctuary is that there's an emergence of Palau's offshore fishing company, not just BOFI, but CFC, and that the departure of the foreign fleets really opened the market to companies like BOFI. And they learned and adapted to changes while 2020, 21, and 2022 were times of rapid change in Palau. But these companies' success will be contingent upon continued investment and the ability to export. Okay. Now, let's move over to intervention number 2, which is COVID. And as we all know, the demand disruption was from the fact that Palau shut down its border like many countries to prevent the spread of COVID. And what we saw in our interviews is in year 1 in 2020, there was a decline of 60 to 70% of sales. This chart here shows you on the left our baseline assessment of the estimated demand by fish by traders and retailers and what it looked like in 2020 and 2021. So back to our graphic on supply, prices, and sales. Well, reef fish supply was lower, demand was lower, people were spending a lot more time fishing. And so while the supply was not being demanded by retailers, the fish supply that was being provided was being redistributed in the supply chain through non-monetary pathways such as sharing and gifting. Because there was such surplus of supply, there was a decline in prices, and we know that those sales were declined both for offshore fish and reef fish because of COVID. An interesting point here to make that's pretty unique to the Palau case compared to your regional neighbors is that Palau was getting unemployment benefits that buffered losses for retailers and traders. Quote, people had money to spend in restaurants. And so in 2020, really some of the biggest losses that these restaurants would have seen, they were able to buffer because people were receiving those benefits. And some of these retailers and traders credit the unemployment benefits for them being able to keep open their doors in 2020. So some key takeaways from intervention 2, we did see a decline in fish sales and prices in 2020, leading to unsold catch. However, offshore fish was a little bit of an exception due to the supply disruption from Shock 1. Essentially, local fishers, offshore fishers, were able to sell a lot more of their catch than, say, reef fishers were. Okay, now let's go over to intervention 3, which is the reef fish export ban. What we saw is an increase in reef fish supply because, of course, people weren't able to export either for commercial or for personal reasons. It didn't really affect the prices. However, what has been interesting to find out is that while there was a decline in reef fish sales for export, retailers have seen an increase in sales for offshore fish because offshore fish can be exported. So retailers are, while they're seeing a decline in how much people are buying to export, they are seeing an increase in their offshore fish sales so people can export that in coolers. Some key takeaways, again, decrease in reef fish sales and increase in offshore fish sales for the reef fishing ban. So this could potentially lead to some interesting outcomes. We could see an increase in reef fish population and healthy coral reef systems because in combination with COVID and this reef fish export ban, there might have been a decline in reef fishing overall. However, Recovery of reef fish populations and reef systems will take time, and both social, economic, and ecological monitoring is needed to understand the full effects of the bans. Okay, now we're on to our second and last question. What were the compounding effects? And what I'd like to touch on is that the PNMS disruption helped to maintain a high price for local offshore fishers' catch. It pushed the foreign fleets out and opened the market for local fishers. The COVID intervention had a demand disruption which prevented any kind of unintended consequences from the PNMS as far as tourist demand, but it also helped to buffer some of the losses that we could have seen from that. And then intervention 3, the reef fish ban reduced fishing effort, and in combination, COVID and the reef fish ban, we might be seeing a reduced pressure on reef fish for retailers and exports. And what we also might be seeing is an increase in offshore fish sales so that residents can leave with that fish and take it to other places. Okay, let me just quickly summarize. We talked about you'll see these 3 interventions here: PNMS, COVID, and reef fish export ban. The PNMS catalyzed the decline in supply of offshore fish and a price hike in prices. But the decline in sales in offshore fish was really driven by COVID, and it drove a decline in reef fish. And then the reef fish ban kind of did a little bit of opposite, where it increased the supply of reef fish because that reef fish could not be exported. It didn't really affect the prices, but retailers saw an increase in offshore fish sales because people were no longer able to export reef fish. Okay, now we're on the cliff of another beginning, which is tourists returning. And what do we need to remember about that? We need to remember that tourists are willing to pay for a local sustainable brand of offshore fish. We don't want tourists leaving with money that they are willing to spend in Palau. So it's really important to think about how to actualize and how to develop a sustainable brand. We also need to remember that a consistent supply of offshore fish is vital to avoid an increase in tourists' reef fish demand, and that tourists are willing to come to Palau even if they can't eat reef fish. And then just a few pieces of key takeaways for the future. It's very important to continue monitoring Palau's fisheries value chains and reef fish populations to inform decisions on scale and scope of future policies. And local suppliers of offshore fish like BOFI and PCFC will need continued investments and ability to export for business viability. Thank you, and I'm really happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thanks so much, Stacy. A lot of good information. However, for the sake of older listeners, I would like to just kind of summarize what you've been doing so if you could bring it to the slide for the summary.
Sure thing. Let me share that.
Right. Summary. Yeah. Let's stop it over there, and then I just kind of briefly explain to the local audience. Ngal talk tanga sing siya will start to lumay sila may aurora bela 2016. Raw era ralo multial PNMS kadarogul madingin sa 2015 sila amlo sa okay kung kadmo osmria ogal basentra de bela blur belau il basenta open el girela a domestic fishing ay el guadio mga adra bluma alu vendría al sibira adra bluma erbela dito mal dinga era al sel seguir el 20%. El hacer abolo seguide abol 2016 hasta hicimos start tour Miguel gora atial urere la gora va al dullo así cuando me seguel el todo el ñadilu para el seguir el 2016 el mire el lo así Miguel el gora va hablo clungol el mal ben gora va hablo lu robot taklel el melmut trelang no hace interventions agot el dilu por seguir era gobida así dimla ka o sea lo multial el PNMS en los statos gora galecta ya del togora gora mala information gira ya el pal de mes se lo así ngara tetelel sel se supply ela sel dungra toro me de trigel suppliers trigel adro omnger ngara tetelel sel supply adal mura e un me ultrani el molmu traral ma aral ma otrulel ayegi dalu ngotmok kol molmo esera 19 enyam lonia covid mese estaram le soise bil mogora wal do sen mlo mal ek legal togora el tial al PNMS mandire kam no mesa ayegi esera lo mesa seguid en gora wablo el blactaculo así sera era covid e aygal maklol dial la adriga ara erbelal en trigem lo stop ngara esera 2020 ma seguid aygal erwapi ITI ma gang adriga operate mamle blactaculo se sel time en wable el blot ara langigle len le maklol gombalia ol traum wal kla asibi ritmira awal me ol trani mum dimle este blok club with el sense bond $2.70 a pound e gore sera a 2020 a nantim el boria covid en gora wal rural mum itu to ora la gang le drogul modina semlo de al turist el merablur belau en di ul gora dimle el gora mele mol maigal de selo trulle de ma aru aigal bli la blungur gida mele el gora mele mol el open ayegi del $1 adrang barda federal program tiada CWIO ayam le ul mengora mlomitut otrule la igal ngig lending mles edel gora dim ke wogid lo tilil el asera 2021 el merela es el momento o atara gid intervention así seguidra ada asmuri lo sem modia adol tob drangal refish gal ngigre mel maluben klingigel seguiden etmil satel gibel gora trigibel gora ngil se ekla ora la gel ngigel wal el ngil se ekel dagdo sengil se ekel mora aradel logal malal oy ngaria amotral girel omang dirada sindel la ul ngil se ekla otrule la ngigra wabo fimarang arada sindel no aral me ul duruk makrebelaw o si siltam tendría que tigla se será 2020 me lo simretial lo simretial modega yeyi del dial omedra aka era dial omedra ngod blu ngara era al sera del belaw seguid la bola seguid e gida direct no swala se ngilas ara la yeyi del ngigel ngol umle tu se mentira au era along simra au era long simra del belaw será abrir a los simra 2020 nyam lo klak lu ma dolo a bond mengora diswadlo oge ga gidel gora amlanga dongo al sela 16 el mer al time megor o mesa sei te gidel PNMS te ya gora wal sebel el somosmo maluben gora smisi ise tora supply prices el mosbedel open egal mos ved el open gagi del wa sel bofi sel tara a dial omne del ngara era wal on riad belaw mos ved el gagi del PNMS se smisi atgora otrule langlit gagi del michael belaw maluben smisi agel otrule gagi del tublo gombali el mera Cloud Trara de la Chel Belao, será el bolgo biden wal será bolgo biden wal goramlo o diaga ngwablo lagas malo trula ngigel magadamlo mesra lwasenglo ngwablo kloa amateur ngigel seguidra bolgo biden lo gora Maximum Raptor Bises mengwablo gora kloa amateur ngigle ali tiabe saya idrom subira lom subel ngai del toktang sera 16 el mera last year seltara gora wado sperin mosom smith tagi del mosom smith presentation así será ada tutti sel tola sem modiaga dolor tobdra Kial klinik el macre belao en direct el gora hablo si se lo hacen lo Claudio Mandra gagi del mloklo askela gagi del ngigil ngole mlo rin segi del la sende kadol top da ngigil ay gagi da gel gora wal el daitalom so de la gal ay gel result malu ben ge kat tagi del subun gal toktang amil ngat mokuni summary of key findings okay, Stacy, I pretty much summarized the key findings. And there's something that I would like to touch on. Can you go down on your presentation? Elang ngoguk tagi dalam sube mula berkata kasi arturista agongay ilwasi sabil gogel hara gal restaurant malu temo omura restaurant elnya ultra gal el telangi gilwar misal bolwai segi deng sebe delo da sei makda kada sob clean gal gu clean gile omgong ngaria autobel supplier gal gidel gilwar malu ben multbel daqla mulod daqla mgim del ngigil wa tela ngigil wa en sebe del gora sebe ngogi talam subet talam tiase sebe direk gora mo sob klitial guk adra bulul ngara al soril maigal al klingigil mong se gidel to gora sei local sustainable brand of offshore fish omkong moria gora agora wal brand malibang gora wado dongli to la sei tiat elangi gil ngol mo gora ngaria autobe el wai segidel endira kat sibel wado gora musu seura argan godang el mo oroy de tialo mo spela klingigil Hindi kalau kita dalam sub dalam tiga lah say turista dah kalau selalu say hindi kalau di malmon mulsoril merbalau alsum hindi kalau dah si il mga igal refish Stacy can you go back to the two main questions before the study begin?
Okay, let's see.
Oy, mela Stacy sa bolong at mo kutalom sube mo salo ndim na tiblo to sa soril mo ongere mo soril wasay ngwangra nga el malubeng sel impact regal luspel angigl maaral maotrulel seral along simula PNMS bodo sis regal keldel intervention regal keldel togol niya gora adilub tiale era covid amina era along simula PNMS ma sera covid ma el al time se am le otro question sa long so subrin me la gay the slide del mes ruriu la gay am longer gay on eru am le say direkata ongeru ngere mesori lo meseni am mesori mo meslo sei ma ngara gelu dokiala ngara mo dokiala gel gorawal effect malu ben gorawal ngadela togora selda se value chain no togora adro omnged mangelol trau adro omnged material traders trigel malme go coltrau material مجرد retail retail se da seguir el restaurante y da que te blow el el cuestión mesori longer seguir presentation caída station odor drilo así hay que guida y el omso de la y el bec el todo el lo mes el girela girela angad el maluben ngorawabol effectra ya photography series el mera klangar ade may guida y el gira que hay tublo el gear malo ay seguir la presentation la Stacy ma sumong ko radya ka gere en la momrektial you can go back to the last slide. Okay, so tiagit sel da sen git take away for the future adoral mor madad ngira del malmol masay ngira del luadong wal say gid el togora tial togora a omulul ma makatengel ma otrul langi gile ngira del malmol masay del baral morwe ya agegi del local fishing company wa bo fima ay gaya gire del wada dolmol mel lolong sew malu bugda malas mel milisi mongos el malmol metiagi del mosum el momsisi a togor tiagi del gagi del gombali nya malu ila rudringi leng local gombali ndia kal adra ngod blu tang ngom ngil teblo gombali belaw mom mos el smisi ay gagi matamal mol mel الوال لولمون من غير أي من والقرا تبعلا وهذا واسع نقول تبعل سبعل غير يعني كله ندي هذا قرا واسع كله بلولا يعني كله توسن كذا سبيسي من غير أي من سبعل بك البويل تيجوا هذا إكسامبل إن شاء الله سي بك البويل إن شاء الله سي كذا إكسبكترا أقيم الطول تلا يلو فينتونا هاي ونقول كذا سبيسي أجي تبلغم بالين mong mo sa edlo sa okay ang bekkel builan sa edlo mes langara o gimul tolet ela tuna sa igideng sa el lungir murta ga restaurant rigid la tora wa otrul nga gidul tuna e allora al mom sisi en mas edel direk el gora awado le se bakki me ol tral mora kel bela le ngil tial program remut se agora lulasma dolas mel molgoni mong malungi la rudra tialum sibila STACI ya sel kapira presentation ang agora brief من سبب الموت الغرا أو مسرني الغرا سي أنغير يجيل الغرا ملو داخل لونيل كلاد ما مش هذا الغرا يوم الأندرستاندينج يجيد الجيل تيال الغرا أوفشور فيشريس ما هذه البريف فيشريس ما ذا لو أيسي ديمنا سجيت سر presentation يا الله كغرا غير ما أغرا تيال program يجيد دي مريكا مسيمر ما سيل بوك ميل بلسيل. Okay, STACI, I just thank the public for tuning in and listening. That will conclude our program. If there's any, if there's no call-in question, then our program is now closed. So thanks again, STACI, for taking your time to come to this radio show and share the result of your study regarding Palau fisheries, both offshore and inshore.
I'm happy to answer any questions. If people have my email address on that last slide, feel free to contact me. If there are no questions right now, I'm happy to answer any questions over email.
Right. Wasal sum da ka kalira sel presentation niya ngani sel email matsum ngani ngi dilat. For example, tigal adra gal moklol gombali malibing idil business. El soril gora al mutulo gorgera. By the way, ngasa loror ang diregal regal morgole de regal lo mais me loror. En diregal me interview tigid adra wabo fi ma adra tourist ma adra. Un solo el musegi del gora cloud ngera sei. Uspelang gal ngil tora tourist ma dir adra blue ma gal business ngora tetel sea amle diregal gora beisa subel. Anyway, yung wasa segi del presentation ni sel last slide ang area email ma ngidil adel soal gora guktiyo gera gel di direct el moria sel email ngi en kagi dra sel sum gora da gere tel program ridere adi meritan e mosimre ma again ak mutmal me asul adel mosil tune in komal masawra direct support mil gere tel el sure gid من سيد المول من القرى وضع أي سراد لونغليت هيجيل قوك بس الملاذوب ما قوك كوريول ملام قطموك لمن سراد المومدين يجيل وابلو الجيك قاريم على ونسالتني مقامال مساو التونين من جايد البريوس الأيسرا بقرا سنتر قوك غيرسل ملتمل نيا تيال مرال ملو غير لورور أكلو رتوتاو هذا لا شيء كمان سلام program ريدا دي متجيد close. Thanks again, STACI. Seems like there's no calling, so we are now closing the program. Thanks again. We'll see you whenever.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Talngim, oh you, Tarawra Hotel Balula, Limbalti. الملك كرم رمضان